Marcy Medvedow, Executive Director of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy, and along with Dan Henstrom, Faculty Director, and Abby Chingo, our Administrative Assistant, we're delighted to have you here for Protecting Workers' Rights in Massachusetts. This program, which is being co-sponsored by the Public Interest Law Foundation and the BC Law National Lawyers Guild, and which is being recorded, was inspired by the report that Professor Reena Parikh and her Civil Rights Clinic wrote in collaboration with the Brazilian Workers Center and Lenita, Executive Director there and one of our panelists today, studying whether a law enacted in 2014 regarding domestic workers was being enforced. We'll hear about that law entitled the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, and we'll hear from individuals working with other employee groups, such as farm workers and workers in the hospitality industry. We begin our program today with remarks by State Senator Lydia Edwards via Zoom. Senator Edwards is a longtime public service lawyer, having worked at GBLS, focusing on labor issues. She served as a Boston City Councilor prior to her election as state senator, and she is well known among really all of us for her advocacy, her activism, and her work on affordable housing, energy, transparency, and so much more. East Boston is her home, but she works, as her website notes, to, quote, make our Commonwealth more affordable, more inclusive, and more democratic. The senator graduated from American University Washington College of Law and received an LLM in taxation from BU School of Law. Please welcome State Senator Lydia Edwards.
Hi, everyone. I want to especially say hello to my dear friend, former colleague, Lenita. I see you looking up at me. And I wanted to note in that bio, before I went to GBLS, but after I left Big Law, because I was laid off, I found myself, I understood what organizing is. I learned Portuguese. And I learned what it meant to have multiple layers of oppression, silence workers, by working at the Brazilian, then Immigrant Center, now the Brazilian Worker Center. So much of what I'm able to think about, push for, and advocate for is because of what I learned there with my colleagues, such as Lenita, then Natalicia, and so many other amazing people. So I'm grateful for the movement. And this morning at a labor breakfast, a friend noted that the movement kind of birthed what I've been able to do and where I've been able to come. So before I talk about anything, I'm always expressing a form of gratitude for the immigrant workers, the worker centers, there are many, and those who, there's a special level of bravery that I think we need to acknowledge. It's much easier to analyze workers' rights. It's much easier to be thinking about the laws from our protected privileges, whether it's as elected officials, whether it's white skin, whether it's being male, whether it's being in an academic institution, but having to be the actor and the recipient of a lot of that oppression as a low-wage worker, as an undocumented low-wage worker, as an undocumented low-wage worker who doesn't speak English. I want to acknowledge the true heroes of this movement that we have the honor to analyze, talk about, and work with. So I have some brief remarks, but I think part of what I want to talk about, and I know the panelists are going to go into the deeper parts of the law, the history, and also theories around workers' rights. But I think what is oftentimes forgotten in a lot of what we are discussing is how much of our workers' rights, labor rights, and organizing is a response to this country's original sin of slavery, anti-Blackness, and also anti-womanness. And so much of the industries that we're going to discuss, farm workers, hospitality workers, and of course, domestic workers, so much of what they dealt with was because of this country's original sin. And so much of that, associating those types of works and industries with Black people. And so much of that is about oppressing Black people at the time, that we ended up inheriting that legacy and implementing a lot of that in the workers' rights laws that we have today. So we just left Black History Month and we're now Women's History Month. And I was just speaking on labor issues at the labor breakfast, but I thought it was really important that we ground ourselves in how much being pro-labor And pro workers' rights means that you are anti-racist and anti-sexism, and really needing to pull that conversation in when we talk about these things. It's not enough to talk about workers' rights as it's separate from, or I would say exploitation of workers as it being separate from being anti-Black or anti-woman. And a lot of that, again, was through the research that I had to do when we were part of the movement. So much of that was necessary, and it's very helpful to the movement in order to build bridges. And I'll just want to talk about them with domestic workers, especially. We did not have the funding. We had maybe a budget of $30,000. I'm kind of looking at Lenita, she can't tell, but I think we had a total budget of $30,000. It was a woman and immigrant-led movement. We were trying to change decades-old laws in Massachusetts, counter to even, and get better rights than the federal government. And a lot of the women that we were working with were undocumented. And that combination, no money, being undocumented, trying to get more rights than everybody else, and trying to do all those things, that combination normally results in utter failure. And in many cases, the academic institutions would be studying, why didn't that movement take off, and so on and so forth. Instead, we're in a blessed position to talk about why we won some things and why some things need to be improved upon. And I believe, for me, in order to build bridges with and between different races of domestic workers, between different class levels of women, and of course with policymakers, I had to bring up the nasty history as to how we got here. And when we centered it on the fact that the New Deal excluded farm workers, domestic workers, and other workers that were not predominantly white men, when we grounded on that original sense. And why? Because the South wouldn't sign on to the New Deal if it included especially domestic workers and farm workers. In the South in the 1930s, thinking we're dealing with the grandchildren, sometimes children of slaves. So when you have that legacy, the narrative didn't become just we want more rights. It was we have to undo the harm. And that actually helped with a lot of lawmakers feeling like we're not asking for more, actually we're asking for parity. We're asking for the same treatment and respect that you give to construction workers. There's the questions that I would get in court, for example, why do I have to pay that nanny? She had to sleep at some point overnight. The questions that I would get, such as, well, I mean, she wasn't actively engaged, she was eating food, so she wasn't really working with the child, therefore I don't have to pay her for that. That kind of picking apart of her skill set and her workload was never given to her male counterpart, who was maybe in construction, who may not have the entire time had a jackhammer in his hand the entire time, or may have been walking across the lot at some point, or if he was a security guard, may have dozed off at night. No one questioned whether he should be paid. They paid him. So how we were able to pick apart, define, and say that this job just is a deserving of extra scrutiny and deserving of extra doubt of its significance. Again, I had to remind a lot of people, especially women who are professional, who relied on domestic workers, that their oppression, they're asking those questions, is a form of oppression, and it's class-based, that they would do that to their nanny. And just remind them at the same time, those like you receive microaggressions every single day when you're trying to bust down that glass ceiling at your courthouse, in the surgery room, at your university, and so on and so forth. You are internalizing and expressing that onto your nanny in many cases. And so being able to build those bridges through a shared moral obligation to undo this nation's original sin, but also to connect how those rights have a lot to do with the slavery and the economic benefits that were given to employers. For here in Massachusetts, it mattered so much so that we were able to, in one session, we introduced a law. It became law by the end of the 2 years. That is historic in and of itself. And I can't, I don't know if I can't tell if you're in class. I heard something, anyway, but that is it. that is historic in and of itself, and our ability to change systemically something so huge, and then to back it up with regulations. And I want to just talk about that as well very quickly, what it means to pass a law and then what it means to make it real. It's so many different levels. The organizing will continue for however, I don't know, as long as it will, because even though we have minimum wage, we still have minimum wage violations. Okay. So just for some people who might be critical of domestic worker, the law itself, how impactful it's been, how many people have been able to benefit from it, just remember that that minimum wage has violations every single day, and we have not been able to perfect the organizing and the obliteration of wage theft. So this is still new, but so I just want people to be reminded of that. That being said, we took to and worked with then Attorney General Healy, and the regulations that back this law up are some of the most aggressive and progressive ones you will find. We knew that domestic workers unlikely were, though they have now a right to a written contract after working 16 hours, there was no way the average person was going to walk in with a well-written contract that she just managed to come up with and began to negotiate with individual employers. That was a setup. So instead, we actually went through the law and drafted a sample contract that is fill in the blank. And so she walks in saying, well, as a matter of law, I actually have to have a contract. Here is one from the state, not me, that we can go through together that makes it easier. And that contract is available in 4 different languages. We also had to make sure that the devil's in the details, and judges could easily undo a lot of our rights. So making sure we defined what is the number that could be deducted for meals, making sure we define what could be deducted for housing. All of that was put into the regulation on purpose. And so ultimately, I bring that up only to remind ourselves and our folks that the next big regulation battle is when it comes to driver's licenses. And that, again, that is connected to labor, that's connected to immigrants. And so we also have a whole, I'm just putting up the bat signal for you guys to know that we have another fight. But ultimately, I'm extremely hopeful. I'm extremely grateful for the lessons learned, the ability to organize, and the laws that I now get to help pass and also continue to fight for domestic workers. So if you guys have suggestions and improvements on the law, happy to be, ironically, the senator that can file those things and hopefully pass them. But I'm grateful for this conversation. I'm grateful and forever happy to see my sister, Lenita, and all immigrant workers, especially those who are undocumented in this state, who are unseen by so many people. I am forever grateful for the lessons you taught me. Thank you.
For being a supporter of the Rappaport Center and working with us to bring interesting programs and to have your voice heard here. We appreciate it and all the work you do. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Professor Reena, who joined BC Law School in 2020 as an assistant clinical professor and founding director of the Civil Rights Clinic. Her students work on both litigation matters and on policy matters, and they love the clinic, as told to me by many of the students. They also teach us classes on the incarceration law and critical perspectives in the law. Prior to joining BC Law, Professor Parikh was a Robert M. Cover Clinical Teaching Fellow at Yale Law School, where he co-taught in the Worker and Immigrant Rights Advocacy Clinic. She began her legal career as an associate counsel in the Office of Chief Counsel for United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, where she spent 5 years. During her tenure in the federal government, she completed a detail as a special assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of New York, and she also clerked in the U.S. District Court for the District of South Carolina. She earned her J.D. summa cum laude from American University, where she was a public interest public service scholar. She received her BA cum laude from none other than Boston College, where she was a valued presidential scholar. Please welcome Professor Freeman.
Thank you so much, Lizzie, and welcome everyone. We really appreciate you being here today to be a part of this important conversation about the state of workers' rights in Massachusetts. I want to kick off where Senator Edwards started and just say that, as Lizzie mentioned, I direct the Civil Rights Clinic, and among other things, we advocate on behalf of and with low-wage immigrant workers. And as a clinic, we really try to center our work around questions of race, gender, and identity. And so I just appreciated that grounding that Senator Edwards provided, particularly the sort of the history and presence, right? The history is not just in the past, but the legacy of slavery and racism and sexism is present and really reflected both in the laws, the conditions on the ground, all of which we're going to talk about today. And so I am very excited for you to hear from our panelists. I will briefly introduce them and then we'll get the conversation started. So we are very lucky to have some great collaborators with us today as panelists. I'm proud to say that our clinic has worked in different capacities with each of our panelists. And I encourage you to read their bios in the Rappaport materials. They've had very inspiring and distinguished careers. So my introduction will be brief, but I'll start with Lenita, who's in the middle here. She's the executive director of the Brazilian Workers Center and chair of various coalitions, including the Driving Families Forward coalition related to the passage of the driver's license bill, which allowed immigrants without documentation to obtain a driver's license, as well as many others, which hopefully she'll share with us, and has just really become a leader and a face in a lot of ways of the workers' rights movement that is immigrant-led and women-led in this state. Our clinic had the pleasure of working with BWC on the 2-year study that culminated in a report we published in January on the efficacy of the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, which I'm sure Lenita will talk more about. We have to my left here, Professor Harris Freeman, who teaches at Western New England Law, who has spent a great deal of his career researching, writing, and advocating for workers' rights. I think it's rare in my experience to see a professor who is as much of a professor as they are a coalition member and an advocate who really tries to bring their theory and scholarship to life. And so that's why Professor Freeman is so impressive to me, because it's sort of an aspiration that I have to kind of be that kind of professor who is just so rooted in the real life consequences of the things I'm studying. And so is part of various coalitions. The two I'm familiar with, because I've had a chance to work with him on, that has to do with farm workers and temporary workers, and I'm sure he'll tell us more about his work with those coalitions. And to my very far left, we have Jeffrey Nelson, the Deputy Director of Research at Unite HERE Local 26, which is a union that represents hotel, hospitality, and dining hall workers, amongst others. And Local 26 is a really powerful union in the state. I don't know if some of you might have read about their battles with the Marriott and other sort of hotels, but Jeff in particular, his work and his research and guidance has really been invaluable to the rest of the union leadership in navigating through major moments in the last, at least I can say the last 5-10 years, whether that be new contracts, negotiations, strikes, and particularly leading the union through the pandemic. And so with that, I just want to welcome our speakers and begin the program. So I'd love to hear from each of you a little bit more about the organization or coalition that you're a part of. What kinds of workers you represent, and what does your organization, do on behalf of them? So we'll start with you, Lenita, and then we'll go to Harrison and then Jeff.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? My name is Lenita. I am an immigrant from Brazil. Living here in the US for about 16 years. So I started work at the Brazilian Worker Center in 2010 after being fired from my job for being pregnant. So that when we started was already something that domestic workers had to deal with. So the Brazilian Worker Center is an organization that was founded by workers for workers in 1995. It's an immigrant-based organization, worker center. The work we do is organizing the workers, advocacy, and file campaigns and try to work to change law that's not working for the immigrant worker community. The Brazilian Worker Center, even the name is Brazilian, so we don't discriminate. So anyone that comes to our door that needs support or needs some reference or anything that people comes to us, we try to support the workers. Of course, we cannot do everything. So we're a small organization, but we have many other partners that we work with that nobody comes to our door and we just say, no, we don't do this. So what we can do, we do, and what we can't, we find someone that can do it. So the person doesn't leave without response. The Brazilian Worker Center, usually before the pandemic, so we used to see around 10,000 workers a year. So we not only serve and see the workers that comes to our office, but we go to the community. So we go to church, we go to health fairs, we go to anywhere we invite. So I'm here today. Even, of course, we have some workers here, not the workers that we defend, but so anywhere we invite to come and to share our experience, to learn with others, this is the opportunity that we take. Today, I will be talking about the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, but we work in coalitions. So right now, we are part of 4 coalitions. So I am the co-chair of the Wage Staff Coalition that work with unions. I am co-chair with the AFL-CIO, and we have been working to try to improve the wage tax law. I just decided to co-fund another coalition that I am in partnership with 2 other organizations that will lead the tuition equity at this legislative year. So the tuition equity will support the students, especially undocumented students that now they cannot apply for tuition or any type of go to college. And that's what we're going to be work on to change the law and make this affordable for the immigrant students. We work on the injury worker bill. That is a bill that will give more tools for workers that suffer injury at the workplace. And right now, sometimes they cannot even, they go to seek medical attendance and the insurance, the companies pay we're gonna pay and until they find out who's gonna pay for the bills and support the workers get proper assistance. And the last one is the Driving Families Forward that we passed the driver's license bill that called Working Family Mobility Act last year. So I think it's right to say that we passed that bill 3 times. So because we had to pass the bill, how come? Yes, we had to pass the bill in the House and the Senate. Then the governor vetoed, so we have to override. And then we finally get the bill signed by the Speaker of the House and the Senate President. 6 days after we learned that the opposition, the people that doesn't like and think that immigrant workers doesn't deserve being here or have a license, they file with the Secretary of State to bring the bill to a ballot. So we had a campaign through the summer that we call Decline to Sign, that we was trying to inform the voters what was that collection of signature was, because the sad part of this is because they didn't have estimate. So they was just lying or just not telling people the truth to be able to collect the signature that they need to bring to the ballot. So I myself went many times to the stopping, like Stop and Shop, market, all kind of supermarket place that there was, collect signature based on wrong information. So I will tell people, okay, you have the right, if you think it should not be driving, it's your right. We're not saying it's what you think, but you need to know that this is a law that passed. It's not something that we're trying to, because they were saying wrong stuff about it. And then we went to the ballot and we won for the third time at by the large population that thinks that agree with it. It's going to be better for everyone if everyone that is driving know what they're doing and have to take the same test and have been through everything that we all do it. I'm going to be now I drive, and my son is 12, he's going to be driving soon, and I'm going to be like, okay, everybody that drives alongside of him knows what they do. At least they're supposed to. And if they do something wrong, the law will apply because they're supposed to do the right thing, right? So that's why I say we won 3 times. And now we are working on implementation. I have been meeting with INV, DOT, and the Attorney General's office to make sure that the confidentiality regulations and the other things that INV needs to put in place by July 1st will be done. So this is some of all.
Thank you so much, Lydia. I think one of the points you're raising is that, you know, when we think about workers' rights, we should not think about them in a silo or separate from other kinds of rights, right? So most people might not think of access, transportation access, driver's license access, and issues of rights for folks without, you know, documentation as a workers' rights issue, but it is so explicitly so. And so if you're here and you think of yourself as a labor activist, you know, you should also be an immigrant rights activist. You should also be someone fighting for those benefits. The population, as we're going to learn today, of low-wage workers in industries in Massachusetts is often immigrant, folks with various statuses, right? So thank you for talking about sharing that. We are going to now move on to Harris, and just for you all to know, we're keeping these sort of opening remarks brief because we are going to get into a discussion that digs a little deeper into the landscape of laws and protections for the various communities that our panelists work with. So Harris, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Reena, and thanks to the center and also to the Lawyers Guild and the Public Interest Law Foundation for hosting this really important conversation. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with folks from the Brazilian Workers Center and Unite Here, people in the workers' rights movement that are really in the forefront of dealing with the problems of low-wage immigrant workers. Given that we're also talking about labor rights, I just wanted to give a shout out to my own union. I'm part of the Massachusetts Society of Professors, where I teach at the University of Massachusetts along with Western New England. We have a graduate program in labor studies that sends organizers and researchers to the labor movement. So some of my work is also there. You know, we live in a very blue progressive state, but we are also a state that has a shameful gap in its workplace laws, both with respect to what they are and how they are enforced. We have hundreds of thousands of essential workers who are misclassified, subcontracted, exploited, discriminated against, suffer from the problems of being undocumented in our society. And at times we have no laws to address these problems. And at times we have laws that are not being effectively enforced. I've dealt with 2 groups of workers who fall in these categories. One is agricultural workers. And I've been doing that as part of the Fairness for Farm Workers Coalition, which has been an organization of Western Massachusetts workers centers and legal service organizations, and statewide, it's also included labor organizations and immigrant rights organizations that is fighting to eliminate the sub-minimum wage in the agricultural workforce. Anybody here know how much agricultural workers are entitled to by law in Massachusetts? What's the minimum wage in Massachusetts right now? $8 for farm workers. No overtime pay for farm workers. So we are working on a bill that's been reintroduced this session for the second time to eliminate the sub-minimum wage and begin to establish minimum overtime standard, rest breaks, days off with pay for farm workers, which they do not have now. And I'll come back to farm workers in a second. I also am part of a national organization called Temp Worker Justice. You can find us at tempworkerjustice.org, which has been an organization that has grown out of the struggle and representation of workers who are hired through temporary staffing agencies. About 13 million Americans churn through staffing agencies each year. And then there's a large number of permatemps, people who have jobs permanently through staffing agencies. That number is in the millions. They all receive substandard pay. They hardly ever get vacation pay, benefits, healthcare, anything else through the staffing agencies. And we have been organizing campaigns, both organized temp workers who've introduced national and state legislation to address the substandard conditions that these low-wage workers face. Again, mostly immigrant workers and workers of color. But I want to spend a little bit more time in the few minutes I have to open this to talk to you about farm labor in Massachusetts. There are at least 13,000 farm workers in Massachusetts. It's an overwhelmingly Latino workforce. There's some Jamaicans who are also part of the workforce. And most are Central American. Most are undocumented. The largest chunk of these folks live out my way, about 100 miles west of here in the Pioneer Valley, where we have amazingly fertile farmland along the banks of the Connecticut River. If you like asparagus, it's the asparagus capital of the world. And all of the berries, the fruits, the vegetables, the livestock that is raised out there is done with the work of farm workers who are only entitled to about $8 an hour. The work is brutal. I've done factory work. I'm a former auto worker, and that was really hard, but it is nothing compared to how hard farm workers work. It's seasonal. You work, 10 hours or 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. You don't get any paid rest breaks by law. And as I said, you get no overtime for 60 and 70-hour work weeks. To sort of pile problems onto the injuries of work up until recently, until the work that was being done by Lenita and others to allow immigrants who are undocumented to get driver's licenses. All these farm workers had to travel from their homes in the north end of Springfield, really one of the most impoverished and segregated areas in the nation with regard to Latino white segregation, would be traveling north into the fields. And it was rather routine for these folks to be stopped by the state troopers. And they would be routinely, as a result of an ordinary traffic stop, end up in immigration removal proceedings. Hopefully, that kind of over profiling that has been going on the state highways in our part of the state. Housing is really bad for farm workers in the north end of Springfield, up in the northern part of Western Mass near Turner's Falls. And the challenge of organizing these folks is significant. Most farm workers, unlike in places like California and Arizona and out in the West, they work on small farms. So you have between 5, 15, or maybe 20 farm workers at a large farm. A few places may employ close to 100. But that makes organizing difficult. Just reaching farm workers at the place of work becomes a challenge for organizational purposes. And this kind of work has taken a turn as a result of having a large worker center in Western Mass, the Pioneer Valley Worker Center, which has done tremendous work bringing these issues to light. And again, a shout out to Reena and the clinic for the white paper that they helped produce that has brought some of this information together about the challenges facing farm workers in Massachusetts. So this is the kind of work that we're trying to do to raise the profile of another group of less than visible workers who, like, the people who do domestic work, the people who make your phones, who live abroad, who are also really low-wage workers. We don't often think about the consequences of all the good food we have on the table there and who is producing it and what they should be entitled to by law. So we can get into a little more of the conversation about the organizing aspect of this, because there is also the beginning of more organizing among farm workers across the United States now to rejuvenate and revive the traditions that Cesar Chavez brought to the civil rights and labor movement, well, half a century ago, far too long ago. So I'm going to stop there, but you also asked more about temp workers in addition to what's going on with farm workers. But I hope that gives you a little feel for who the folks that we are working with and trying to be involved in a struggle just for basic baseline equal wages and benefits.
Thank you so much, Harris. Chad, we'd love to hear from you now, just a little bit more about Local 26 and your work with Local 26.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be on this panel. And I feel like, it's seldom that I'm in a group where I'm like, well, we kind of have it easy. Because at least for our members, right, labor law was built for them, whether it was, it was explicitly not built for domestic workers and farm workers. I actually cut my teeth working for the United Farm Workers many years ago in California. So I have an inkling of how difficult those conditions and that type of organizing can be. But I've been, for many years, I've been with Unite here, which is a national union. We represent approximately 300,000 hospitality workers, and I've worked for our Boston affiliate, Local 26, for almost all of that time. And we here in Greater Boston and Rhode Island represent roughly 12,000 workers in the hospitality industry. So what does that mean? Hospitality includes hotels, so we represent workers in a majority of Boston hotels. We represent lots of university food service workers. We represent workers at Fenway Park, at the new casino in the Wynn Casino in Everett. And recently we've organized and represent concessions workers at Boston Logan Airport. So we have a very diverse membership. People do a lot of different types of jobs, different types of employers. It's difficult to generalize about our membership, but it's I think not surprisingly, it's a largely immigrant workforce. It's majority women. It's majority people of color. And our goal is we sort of have two goals, right? One is to make these jobs the best service sector jobs that there are. And in some cases, we've been quite successful at that. I think, in our mature contracts in places where we've represented workers for many years. So, in particular in the Boston area hotels, our members make our room cleaners, which is kind of the base wage for our members, make up $27.20 an hour, which is, for a kind of a relatively low skill work, job. Not that it's easy, but it's something that people can come into without a lot of education. And folks have a pension. Folks have basically free family health care, a legal plan, an education plan, and a housing benefit as well. So we're very proud of the standard that we've built there, and we're looking to improve on that standard everywhere. I don't think we feel like we're remotely where we want to be. I think when you think about sort of the way I think about it and some other folks think about it is, when will we represent jobs where people will say, I really want my kid to have this job. And, we're not there yet, right? But I think that's the goal. That's where we imagine that we want to be. So one of our goals is just to improve the quality of work for our members. And then we also want to grow. We've been, I think, relatively successful at that. We've organized roughly 5,000 members in the last 10 years or so. So we've grown very significantly as an organization, but There are tens of thousands of workers that are in our industry that aren't represented by a union and should be. So, you know, we have our work cut out for us. So just a little bit about myself. You know, as Reena mentioned, I've done a number of different things for the organization. I am a researcher for the organization, which can mean a variety of things. But I sort of think of my job as to really understand the industries where we represent workers. And so, you know, to be able to think about strategies in terms of how we impact employers and to be able to understand kind of the scope of what we can get. So, you know, really where is the money and how much money is there? I spent most of my career on the hotel industry, which is a kind of a surprisingly confusing industry because there's lots of layers of power in it. So, you know, when you look at a hotel and it says a Hilton hotel, it actually doesn't really tell you very much. That's just the brand name on the hotel. What you really want to know is who's the employer, which might be Hilton, but could be some company you've never heard of. And then actually the most important thing is who owns the hotel. And that's where the real money and power in the industry is. And it's largely real estate investment trusts, private equity are the huge players in the industry, and they're very powerful. And they really hate us. And they hate us for, you know, in the capitalist system in which we live, they hate us for a very legitimate reason, which is we cost them a lot of money. Right? Our members make more money, clean fewer rooms, and make more money cleaning those rooms than folks who are not in the union. And so that has a significant, and hotels, 40% of the cost of running a hotel is labor. So we're a big slice of it. And so whether or not the hotel is union and the quality of that union has a real impact on the value of the real estate. And that's what the decision makers in the industry care about more than anything. So we have very tough fights with all of our employers, and in particular, I would say our toughest employers, our worst employers, are probably hotels. And so, you know, my job is to kind of understand that, understand where the power is, understand what story needs to be told and to what audience, and so to advise the leadership of the union on how best to win the fight that we're in. Yeah, that's a little bit about me.
So yeah, thank you so much, Jeff. I think Jeff's comments, they really highlight the benefits that flow to workers that are part of what we call organized labor. I saw some folks' eyes kind of widen when he said, you know, 28 some dollars, and there are some hotel workers I know that make in the 30s that are part of Local 26. And I think to juxtapose organized labor that has the protections and the benefits that come from a collective bargaining agreement, we have a model that exists in a lot of other industries that called a worker center, and that is often a structure you see in workplaces where there are often not more than one or a few workers, and that create a lot of difficulties in then being able to get enough power to unionize. And hopefully Jeff can talk a little bit more later in the conversation about why that having that numbers is really important in terms of bargaining, because otherwise it's very easy to replace you, right? So I want to turn to Lenita to maybe just share, what a worker center is, because it is distinct in some ways from a union, but has some features that come with that kind of collective nature. And then, to help us understand the landscape for domestic workers legally, and in particular, what the key provisions of that 2014 law, the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights that we've, kind of alluded to throughout are. So, if you could just share with us, what is a worker center, Is it different from a union? And what are the key provisions of the DW? Yeah.
Sure. So the Worker Center is basically a community-based organization. So we don't charge for the work we provide. We don't have the power of bargaining. Of course, we do some negotiation, but in small scale. So, but you negotiate with employers when they don't pay the workers, or sometimes they have some problem with health and safety, but we don't negotiate like contracts. We don't help people to find jobs. So we don't do. So we can't. The only way we can help people to get better wage is through legislation, but we cannot do much as a C3. We are 501c3. That means we cannot take political side. But in some ways that you can do, that's how the Brazilian Worker Center managed to do some of this work is get a C4. So under our C4, we can do some political and endorse candidates and have like build a little bit of power to negotiate. But this is basically the difference. So the unions has more power, more money, and like as you said, the farmer workers get paid $8 per hour when the hospitality workers get paid almost 30. And it's basically both doesn't have to be to go to a school to have college degree to do the work they do. And they have different skills, but it's skills that is it can be achieved by the parents or uncle or somebody relatives. So and it's the amount of money, and both is essential. Like I would say maybe the farm workers is even more because they feed everybody here. When the hotel workers, of course, we're gonna have a clean place to stay and take your time vacation, but not everybody can have a vacation, right? Things like today. But it's still, so you can see this difference in the worker center. So we that's what we do. We educate the workers, we do trainings, and we advocate for the workers in a way that, and we depend on foundations to give us money to provide the work we do. We don't get money from the government. We actually, the Brazilian Worker Center, we get one grant from the government, that is OSHA, that we do training for construction workers. It's the only one, but we have to report every single penny that you use and propose this before. Usually we run by donations, membership, and foundations grants for a specific project.
Oh, thank you so much. I just wanted to make sure that for folks in the audience who were wondering why is there such a big gap and what's the difference between a union and a worker center, that you recognize that BWC is itself a worker center and kind of what it's able to do even without sort of being organized as a union. Lenita, just staying with you a little bit, can you share with us what were some of the key laws that were or rights that were won by domestic workers in the passage of the domestic worker bill?
Sure. So something that is everybody would think like this is basic, this is obvious. We want a domestic worker that is get paid for all the time you work. And everybody say, well, this should be something natural, right? But for domestic workers, as Senator Edwards said before, there is living domestic workers, and there is the domestic worker that comes to a house and live at the end of the day. So the livings, they're supposed to have a time that they can rest, right? The living is the one that sometimes take care of elderly, take care of children, take care of kids with disability. And sometimes the parents say, oh, like Senator Edwards say, oh, if he was eating, the kids were eating, he was not doing anything. But they feel that you're responsible to take care. I work as a domestic worker. When I first came here, I took care of an elderly that was living in Brooklyn. And one time he choked on a piece of strawberry. And I have to be there. I would say, well, so he's just eating, so I'm not working right now. No, you cannot do this. So when you with the elderly or you with the child, you are working, it's your responsibility. And you are working 24 hours sometimes, because if the parents many domestic workers live-ins, they live on the same home as a child. If the child wake up at night or CTU, it's your responsibility and you should get paid for it. And for the house cleaners, sometimes when we first started drafting this law, they was cleaning like 8 hours a day. And the people that was employed, there was another domestic worker. This is another layer that it sometimes doesn't know. The domestic workers employ another domestic worker, and they was paying them only when they was inside the home. So the time that there was travel between houses, there was like the clock was stopped, and they would get the other house, then you get paid. But they was available for that person that was driving the room from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. So you shouldn't get paid for all that time because they could not do anything else but be available. So this is one of the provisions. So we got domestic workers right of 8 weeks of maternity leaves. Right for the workers' compensation, if you work more than 16 hours per week for the same employer, protection against retaliation, and access to MCAD for discrimination and sexual harassment. Because this is what's something out that other worker has protection, but domestic workers, if they suffer sexual harassment or discrimination at the workplace, they could hire a private attorney, but they could not file with the government agency. That's Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. And this is some. So we have a little of this that has, I know students here, so bookmark. I know she still use books. Today's days, everybody has a return everything, but if you still like to read the book, we have some of this that has some of the provisions of the domestic worker law in English and Portuguese. And have our contact if you want to be in touch with us, volunteer, or anything like that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lenita. I think, we like to, and we're proud to say that the Massachusetts Domestic Worker Bill of Rights is the strongest bill in the country. And obviously, yes, there's a report, and we'll talk about that later, that where we found why the gaps in the promise of the law and the reality and what needs to be done. But just to give you an example, the under federal law, domestic workers don't have a right to overtime when they're living, but in Massachusetts we do. So the idea that Massachusetts provides not only stronger protections than a lot of federal laws protecting domestic workers, but even some of the best in the country, is really a testament to the movement here that's now considered a leader, and other states are sort of calling these coalitions to model their language after ours here. I want to turn a little bit, so Harris started talking to us a little bit about the working conditions for farm workers, and I think really painted a picture for us of some of the hardships. And I wanted to start with you, Jeff. If you could just share with us, what some of the, I think we maybe moved too much in the cushy lifestyle of hotel workers, but our clinics worked closely with Local 26 and had a chance to meet and talk to their members. And working conditions are really challenging for your union members as well. And I just want to hear a little bit more about what those conditions are like, what some of the challenges of organizing this workforce are, and in your remarks, if the pandemic has shifted either of those questions, elaborate on that.
Sure. So it's not easy work. I think the example that I think about most is just the task of cleaning a room. Which our members clean their have a quota when they show up in the morning. They've got a quota of rooms they've got to clean. They have no idea what they're going to find in each of those rooms. So maybe somebody's staying over, and you just need to do a quick vacuum and remake the bed. But maybe somebody's had a big party in there and has completely trashed the place. And people have no idea until you open the door what you're going to find. And so what that means is a lot of times our members will rush through the room to the earlier part of the day, so that they're not in a situation where they get to a room it's 4 o'clock. They got to get up at 4:30 to go pick up their kid, and they find out that that's a room that's going to take an hour to clean. So there's a lot of rushing. There's a lot of injury that results from the rushing, and I think worked very hard and have worked hard for years to try and place some controls over that, right? To limit the number of rooms that have to be cleaned, to provide for drops in those totals when under certain circumstances, like you may be able to clean more stayovers than checkouts. So if you have a lot of checkouts, that reduce the number of rooms you have to clean, and so on. I think one of the challenges that we find in that is that unless the workforce, even if we have great contract language, and in some cases we do have very strong language, unless the workforce is organized and has leadership, they're going to do what the manager tells them they have to do. And the manager has no respect for what's in the contract. It does not matter unless we force them to have respect for it through grieving and arbitrating. But in our shops where we're well organized, folks are able to have a more reasonable workload. In places where we haven't yet built a great organization, that managers have a much stronger hand. One of the challenges that we faced, I can talk a lot about the pandemic and the impact on the industry, but one of the challenges that we faced as a result of the pandemic is actually a national transformation of the industry, where the standard used to be, if you stayed in a hotel room, your room got cleaned every day. And now at all but the highest luxury hotels, what the industry wants is to basically only clean at checkouts. And I think sometimes people see, oh, you're not getting your room cleaned, maybe that's helping out your room cleaner. It's not. If you don't get your room cleaned, there's fewer jobs, first of all, and the jobs are much harder because people end up only cleaning rooms that people have stayed in and made dirty for 3, 4, 5 days. And so, that's something that we've taken on locally, we've taken on nationally, but there's huge savings in that for the employer. They sort of say, well, people don't really want their rooms cleaned every day. I obviously different people will have different opinions, but I think that if you really didn't want your rooms cleaned every day, you'd go to an Airbnb. If you're at a hotel, you're at a hotel because you want your room cleaned. But the pressure on workers and is relentless, and that's been a huge fight we've been in. It's going to be a huge fight going forward. You can see it in the numbers, right? The number of rooms, hotel rooms in the country has increased since 2019. The number of hotel workers has gone down significantly. So that means there's fewer people doing more work.
Yeah, and to that point, one thing our clinic learned was just the way in which the hotel industry was sort of weaponizing environmental rights by sort of trying to frame the issue of not having your room cleaned as being helpful for the environment. And so really trying to pull away, I think in some ways, support from groups that otherwise would be inclined to by presenting this as bad for the environment when the data didn't necessarily bear that out. So thank you, Jeff. I want to turn to you, Harris. You talked a little bit about the working conditions for farm workers, but I know you're also involved with temp worker justice, an organization that is doing national advocacy, and our clinic's working with you in Massachusetts. But what I think some folks might not know, what is a temp worker, and what is this right to know law? What's that legal landscape like in Massachusetts, and maybe some of the conditions for this community?
Sure. Thank you. Temp workers are hired at a staffing agency, and the staffing agency pays their wage. There's typically no benefits, and they pay their workers' compensation insurance, their unemployment insurance, and they send them off to work somewhere else. And the temp agency is paid by the hour for every hour of work the temp does at the place that they're sent. And the temp agency usually gets a fee that is between 20 and 50% more than the worker is getting made for every hour of work. So if you're getting paid the minimum wage of $15 an hour, the temp agency is being paid sometimes double that per hour for every hour you go to work. The rate of exploitation, in other words, is extremely high. I'll give you an example of the largest temp employer in Massachusetts. It's the fish houses, the fish processing houses in New Bedford. New Bedford Fish Houses is one of the largest fish processing centers in the United States. It's a large port. And almost all the employees that work in the fish houses are hired there as permatemps through staffing agencies. They're almost all Guatemalan immigrants, almost all are undocumented. And the conditions there are such that it is not clear to the temp workers who is responsible for making sure they have information about safety equipment, who is responsible for being their supervisor. Oftentimes the question for temp workers is they get hired at a staffing agency, maybe downtown in Boston and Chelsea, and they're told to get on in a van and get transported somewhere where they're not even told where they're going to actually go to work. And they're not even told the name of the employer, the rate they're being employed at, or what kind of training they need to get the work done safely and efficiently. So in Massachusetts, around the time the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights was being passed, there was also advocacy on behalf of this temporary workforce who were permanently in second-class status positions in the workplace. And we passed a very modest but really important bill. It was called the Right to Know Bill, because one of the key problems that temp workers had was not knowing anything about where they were going to work and the rates of pay that they were going to receive when they got there. So the bill required that you be given something in writing in a language you can understand about your rate of pay, where you're going to work, who your bosses are. It limited how much could be charged to take you from the temp agency to the place of work. If workers were being exploited by being charged ridiculous amounts of money just to get to the place of work, often in places where mass transit wasn't going. So we passed a very modest but really important bill to make all this information available to workers. The challenge in the temp industry, as I think is the case among domestic workers, as the report that was produced by the Brazilian Workers Center and the clinic shows, is there's a challenge of enforcement. What we really need on the ground is larger worker centers, more resources for unions to be involved in organizing, because the government does not have the resources to inform workers who are often fearful of government because they're undocumented, to get the basic information about their rights. So what we're doing in the temp worker space right now in Massachusetts is beginning the same conversation that the Brazilian Worker Centers began about what has been done since the Temp Worker Bill of Rights has been passed. What kind of enforcement problems do we face? What is the Attorney General's office doing? What is the Department of Labor doing? How can worker centers be given more resources to fill the gap that's needed to provide rights to these folks? And I just want to say one more thing about worker centers and unions and the workers we're talking about here to close this segment. There has been a gap in labor's ability to organize these workers for a number of reasons. One reason is that the law is bad. The law doesn't permit domestic workers or farm workers to organize under federal law. The other challenge is these are often small workplaces, and unions are trying to maximize their resources to organize the most workers possible. Another problem is not all unions are like Unite Here, who are not seeing the central importance of the labor movement to organize the undocumented low-wage workforce in this country. It is the mission of labor right now to do that. And it is not entirely in the forefront of what all unions are doing. For some it is. And we're seeing things like what's going on in the Amazon warehouses, which are really important. Worker centers are filling an important gap here in ways that Lenita is talking about. Just telling workers who are covered by labor law that you are protected on the job if two of you go to complain to your boss together. Whereas if you go to complain on your own, you are an at-will employee and can be fired, is a huge piece of information for workers. And worker centers have been filling that gap in all kinds of industries across the nation and across Massachusetts. So there's a lot of work to be done on this front that brings these questions to the fore, provides a role for lawyers and labor boards and agencies to step in. But the challenge really is one of resources for this kind of enforcement to educate and organize folks.
Thank you so much, Harris. I think that really segues nicely into kind of our last set of questions. And I wanted to start with you, Lenita. What were some of these gaps that you saw in between the sort of the language of the law, the domestic worker bill of rights, and the reality on the ground? And what does BWC sort of thinking ahead, proposing as a way to close that gap?
I believe it's like two major points that make it harder. One is the fear of the workers to report. So as was said here before, many workers, they are undocumented workers, and they fear for their families, from deportation, from retaliation. And it has to make it clear, people undocumented or outside, it's not because they want to. So this goes to another law, that the immigration laws and the immigration system that take forever. So when I came here, I stayed undocumented for about a decade, not because I want to. I had a process that was going on, and took 17 years until they approved. And I had the right, they accept, they file, and they said, oh, it's gonna take you 900 days. It took 17 years. And the day that was completed 17 years that I was waiting, I received my green card. So when people cannot just wait 17 years to start doing what they should do. Also, you can pay tax, use IT to pay tax. That's what I was doing. I was trying to go to school. I went to register and I was yes, paid out of pocket. I had to take one class at a time because I couldn't apply for state tuition financial aid. That is something that I'm fighting right now. I was fired from my job because I was a domestic worker, undocumented, got pregnant. So I kind of experienced all of these things that we are fighting for. And I think that's make it easier for me to identify with the workers, and because I understand from labor experience, but as the fear and the government agency, they are supposed to put out there the information, they are supposed to reach out. And this is something that the report did. We have some recommendation on the report, the ways that can be done. Because we still have to find the ways and tell them the ways when they should know that since they are there to enforce the law. So they agreed to enforce the law. When we draft the law, we spoke with those government agencies. We said, this is going to be your role. We will enforce the law. And then they just managed to not do it. Everybody knows that domestic workers work on a private space. So they knew that before when we passed the law. They knew it would be their job to enforce, but it's still like a lack of resource, the lack of people, lack of language, and then we still have to keep trying with it. If they don't have resources, I think we have, but we still have to find a way to do this work to make sure that the workers know at least what their right is, and try to support them the way we can through coalitions, to legal clinics like yours, to try to them to seek what they entitled to.
You know, and thank you, Lenita. One of the things that the study revealed is that the Attorney General's office, which serves as the primary jurisdiction over enforcement, really relies on worker centers to provide them with complaints, because it's a complaint-driven system. There are not audits happening in people's homes, right? So what you have is, you know, Attorney General's office and relying on the worker centers to be that liaison between the worker and the AG's office throughout the duration of an enforcement proceeding. And yet the fines that are ultimately levied against the employers are not shared with the worker centers. And those fines go back to the government. So one of the recommendations we had in the report is that if worker centers are helping enforce this bill, there should be a law that allows them to share in the fines and the fees that the AG's office recovers through enforcement. So that not just, for the pockets of Lenita, so that the work can grow, right? So that, because the amount of, she earlier said 10,000 workers. I think you all have like 6 staff, if I'm not mistaken. So can you even imagine the scope of how many workers they could help with, even just funding for one additional staff member? So I want to turn to you, Jeff, to talk a little bit about, Local 26's policy advocacy. And I want you to address something specific, which is, how do you respond? And I'll be asking the same question you, Harris. How do you respond to arguments that employers cannot afford to pay workers the wages and benefits you're advocating for, especially in this post-pandemic era, and that some of these proposals or some of the contracts, in your case, I know it's the contract that really governs the rights, but that those might force the businesses to shut down, and that's not good for the public. So yeah, if you could just take both of those parts, both what is Local 26 looking to in terms of policy advocacy, and how do you respond to those arguments?
Yeah. Well, I may jump off a little bit from the first question, which is sort of in terms of thinking about policy that would be helpful for workers. Just very quickly, labor law is terrible, right? Is it better than nothing? Oh yeah, but it's terrible, right? Can you imagine a law where you fire a worker for organizing, and then the penalty is you have to pay for the wages they lost after they got another job? So it's just the difference, right? I mean, the penalty is so minimal for workers, for employers, that there's really such low risk for firing workers for advocating for themselves. So I think that unfortunately it's very difficult to make changes to that except through a federal law. And we can certainly have our fantasies about that, but we've had those for a long time. In terms of other policy, this is kind of just my pet idea, but I think I'm right, is what I think one of the things that I find infuriating about Massachusetts is that, cities don't have the power to set wages or regulate like they do in many other parts of the country. And that just seems insane to me. And that's really, I think, an attack on workers' rights, right? Like, why can't Boston regulate the hotel industry? Because everything that they want to do has to go through a home rule petition, and the whole legislature has to say, yeah, okay, well, we'll let Boston do that one. Boston is very different from the rest of the state, and they ought to have the power to regulate the industries and to
And it's
set
a lot more
compensation.
expensive than the rest of the state, right? So there's,
For sure. So that's, I think that feels like, I don't feel like enough people are thinking about that. That feels like plausible. So that's something that I'm really interested in seeing. Can that change? And now I've completely got the second part.
no, just how do you respond to folks that argue that higher wages and benefits could lead to business closures, especially in post-pandemic?
Yes. Look, I think that is something that we have to be thoughtful about, but I take a look at the industries that we're in, right? At Fenway Park, what does it cost to have a beer? Right, so like $11, they can afford to pay a little bit more. At a hotel, what does a room cost? It's a cheap one might be $200. It takes somebody half an hour to clean that. How much would you have to pay somebody so that it was not profitable to sell that room? We're nowhere close. we're nowhere close. So certainly in the industries where we represent workers, you know, either like a university food service, we are a tiny piece of the overall pie, or in hotels, they're just incredibly profitable industries. So I really see like, look, I get, you know, that restaurants are a low margin business. That's real. And I think we have to be thoughtful about that. But for where most of our members are and where we seek to organize, these places are making money hands over fist. So I don't have a hard time with that question.
No, I appreciate that, because I think what you're adding is really a question of like, how high is the profit margin? Whereas I wonder, and I want to end sort of this portion of the program with you, Harrison, we're opening up to Q&A. Same question, you know, what do you sort of see as where the future kind of needs to go for, and you can take this, you know, for farm workers or temp workers, and how do you respond to that argument that employers can't afford to pay workers? Because I know that has been expressed by, you know, farmers. And when I mean farmers, I mean the, you know, farm owners, managers.
Yeah. The first time we introduced the Fairness for Farm Workers Act, it was defeated by the Farm Bureau on that argument that this would undermine the ability. It would be the end of Western civilization for agriculture, basically. And the argument is overstated, but also has some truth in it. And I think it's important to be nuanced about this. First of all, when we have industries like restaurants that rely on workers making a decent living based on tips from customers, when we have industries like farming, which depends on the state providing subsidies to workers who are living in impoverished conditions, somebody else is paying for the cost here. It is being shifted, and that is part of the problem. So there are many different ways to deal with this. First of all, there's economic studies show that the actual cost of the increase of food, if you paid farm workers a decent wage and overtime in Massachusetts, would be on the order of 1.5%. Not a lot. At the same time, we have in the bill what has been put in place in Oregon recently, which is to provide a tax subsidy for those farmers who would have to pay overtime, who are truly living in an economy where farmers are getting squeezed by larger middle people who are buying their products and then selling it to grocery stores, restaurants, and et cetera. Farmers are also under the gun, and we recognize that. So part of it is a tax subsidy to provide so that the entire cost of increasing wages is not borne by the small farmer. So, you know, then there's been another effort that was made with regard to tomato pickers in Florida, which were organized by a group called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, where they went on a campaign to ask the fast food restaurants to pay an extra penny per pound for tomatoes that were going on all our burgers and chicken sandwiches and the like, to provide for a decent wage for farm workers. So there are lots of other places to get income here to make farming, you know, restaurant working, hotel working, decent wages. It is simply, and part of it is, if you can't afford to pay people a decent wage, why should you be in business? Really, I mean, do we really feel okay about businesses that are existing based on the super exploitation of working people? I mean, I have a problem with that also. So for temp workers, quickly, there are a bill that was passed in New Jersey and a bill that is on its way to passage in Illinois that is going to require businesses to pay equal work for equal pay for temp workers. So temp workers cannot go into a place and work next to someone else making widgets, and one person's making 20 an hour and the other person is making 11 an hour. That has been eliminated in New Jersey. It's on its way in Illinois, and we are hoping to go down that road here in Massachusetts as part of what we're doing.
Thank you so much. We're going to open up the Q&A. So yeah, please feel free, and I encourage you to raise your hand and ask any question you have for the panelists.
Thanks, thank you all so much for coming. I was wondering if you, like, from a policy perspective, if you could talk about what do you think the new administration is gonna make things make like a more positive policy outlook, advocacy outlook or not. And like, given the importance of the AG's office in enforcement, like what is the code, what are generally what are coalition relationships like with the AG's office? Are they who are they open with their perspective?
Why don't we take, Jeff, if you could, kind of respond to that first part of the question, just about what's the outlook with the new administration, and then, Lenita, I know you work really closely with the AG's office. If you could talk a little bit about where you see the future of that relationship going, and, that way we can also get to.
I'm always happy to talk, but given that we don't have a significant policy agenda right now with the Healy administration, that maybe it's somebody else.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, but maybe Lenita, if you want to kind of answer both, because obviously they're related.
Yeah, so we believe that Healy administration will do better than the previous one. So at least to trying to inform law, work with people that are organizations and community and union that is advocating for laws to be passed. I know, I think it's not, I don't know if it's public yet, but I know that she will put a significant amount of proposed for the budget to enforce the driver's license bill, the Worker Livability Act law, to make sure that the IMV will be prepared and have enough funds and way to respond to them, because we believe that's about 40,000 new immigrants who applied for the license for the first year. That's not 40,000 more people on the roads. These are people that is driving already. So just let people know, people are driving already, but they might be driving without a license, because like Harris was saying, people that lives and work in Springfield, they need to drive sometimes. Or during the pandemic, people was getting a van with like 10 workers, and this is very high risk to everyone who had COVID, so everybody else could get it. So during the pandemic, we saw even more the needs of people to have mobility and transportation accessible. So, and I learned that she, at least for this new bill, it's something that I can say that she has been doing. And she's not putting her committees out there, like she creating committees and counseling that will advise her on communities issues. So they are building some committees that will support her on this. And the answer with the Attorney General's office. So yesterday we met with her. She gave us 30 minutes of her time. So we meet with, when I say we, it's a group of worker centers and some legal advocates that work. So like the BLS, it's one that get money, doesn't charge for the work that they do. They work with roads age immigrants, and we meet with the Child Labor Division every 6 weeks. So we file complaints on behalf of the workers. So we support the workers to learn what is right. And every 6 weeks, we meet with the chief of staff with some of the investigators return to check how they are doing. So how they are doing the work, how they have investigated. So at the Brazilian Worker Center, I just write to them and say, hey, we filed this case and we didn't hear from your investigator, or this happened, or if they do something they are not supposed to, I don't have a problem to say, hey, the law say you're not going to do this, so why your investigator is doing this? So they address those things. So and yesterday, the Attorney General Campbell, she joined us in the meeting to let us know that she is open to continue to do this work. The Fair Labor Campaign, that is the group that we are part of, with Worker Center and other worker centers, we start meet with the Attorney Generals. I think was really, I don't really know the name, but it was the one before Martha Coakley. And then we continue to do with Martha Coakley, then Maura Healy, and then now Campbell came yesterday to talk with us and say that she wants to continue to do this work. She knows that we can see and meet the community, and the community trusts the worker center. So sometimes they don't want to talk with the government because they're afraid. They don't know what the connection and where the information goes. So we do this bridge, and they want us to continue to do this.
Thank you, Lenita. Other questions?
Thank you for coming. The question I had, like, on legal standpoint, what are some of the remedies afforded to the workers? Once you found out that, yes, like some of their workers' rights aren't infringed upon or being violated, what are some of the remedies that they can seek legally?
Yeah, well, it varies a lot depending on what particular law we're dealing with. One of the problems I think we probably see across temp work, agricultural work, domestic work, and even the hotel industry is wage theft. And the remedies for wage theft, of course, can lead to double damage remedies for extensive violations. There's the potential for class action remedies here that provide a remedy for literally thousands of people. For example, right now, there's a discrimination lawsuit, another area of law going on in Illinois, involving temporary staffing agencies and companies that make beauty products. There was just a class certified for wage theft and discrimination involving 13,000 African-American workers in Illinois. So sometimes the remedies can be really extensive, but then as Jeff points out, the remedy, if your labor rights are violated, you're trying to organize or even just to get together to present a problem. The remedies are relatively slim there. And one of the challenges, as Jeff is saying, is this can be very difficult to change federal law on that front. So there's some areas where we get very significant remedies, and some areas where we are clearly without remedies. And temp workers face that a lot for some of these problems, which mount up to a significant sort of, the exploitation is just global. And the big thing we're looking for there is to change the law so you can't pay people less because they're a temp.
And I would just wanted to add that one big challenge, and I know Lenita will be familiar with this with her work, is that the Supreme Court has made it very difficult for a remedy for an undocumented worker who complains of wage theft, for that remedy, if they are fired in retaliation for complaining, to be reinstated. And so because there are immigration laws that prohibit employers from hiring workers without work authorization, if, as you've heard today, retaliation happens and a worker without documentation is fired, it is nearly impossible for a remedy to be reinstated. And so that's really hard, and that in my experience is often why some of the clients we work with, even at the last minute, might decide not to file a complaint, because even if I can tell them, well, we have there's anti-retaliation provisions, we can find them. They're like, well, am I gonna get my job back? And I can't say yes to that. And so yeah, we have time for one more question, or I don't know, I'll defer to you. Let's see. Should we close it out?
Is it quick? Quick question, that's a quick answer.
Thank you so much for coming today. It's really interesting. Can you talk about the problem of over-concentration and monopoly, and how that impacts the work, and then what might be able to be done on the state level to address that?
Taking this quick answer.
Well, one quick answer to this is that corporate power is being shielded by the subcontracting of work. And the more we can do to create laws that hold all employers responsible up and down the chain of employment. And this gets into a question, if you go take any labor employment law course, you'll study joint employment. And that is a significant way to hold the higher level corporate power responsible for the violations that are occurring down the food chain as we subcontract work and contract it out to more, kind of cockroach capitalist outfits that are occupying much of the workspace for the low wage immigrant workforce. That was a quick answer.
And on that note, I want to say thank you to all of you for the work